and welcome to Varn Blog. And here, I am here today with Djene Bajalan, friend of the show, co-host over in the TIR crew, professor of Middle Eastern history at University of Missouri
State University.
Missouri State University. I always get these state universities confused. We need a better naming system. And writer for Jacobin, which I often forget to mention. We are here today to talk about the situation in Iran, the broader geopolitical situation in the Middle East altogether. Talk about the Kurds yet again, because that's your specialty. And maybe also talk about what it means for leftists to give responsible commentary on these matters, because recently I feel like even mainstream news has been kind of more irresponsible than normal in the way it reports this or that thing going on geopolitically.
Right.
So, what for context though, and I'm going to date this. We're talking about this on October 11th of 2022. This will probably go out on October 13th or 14th of 2022. What is going on in Iran that has everyone either excited or talking color revolutions as an insult yet again?
Sure. So, a couple of weeks ago, a young lady visiting Tehran, the capital, from the Kurdish region of Iran, from the small town of Sakez, was picked up by the Ishadi, which is the guidance police, the morality police. They're an arm of the state that is responsible for disciplining people in public spaces, ensuring people are dressed appropriately and according to the requirements of the Islamic Republic, which demands that its citizens conform to a certain dress code when in public. This is not a particularly uncommon occurrence in Iran, but the result of this encounter was that this young lady Djene Amini, was beaten, most likely beaten in police custody, after which she fell into a coma and 3 days later died. And this sparked a wave of unrest across Iran, in many towns in the country, including in the Kurdish region, of course, as well. In fact, some of the earliest protests took place in the Kurdish region, but this was not restricted to the Kurdish minority in Iran and spread to the general population of the country. And the result has been ongoing protests. There have been strikes in Kurdistan. There were strikes in Baluchistan. There was major violence between the security services and the Baluchi population. There have been some intermittent strikes amongst oil workers in Bushehr, but not everywhere. And there's been ongoing protests in the cities, and this in Tehran, as well as in other major places in the country. And the security forces have been quite, brutal in their response. And this has led to deaths. And what is particularly striking is that women are playing an extremely important role in this protest movement. So many of the people who have been killed have been women, some of them high schoolers. There's been cases where high schoolers have been murdered, their bodies have been stolen. It's a really nasty thing taking place. But women, a lot of women in Iran are tired, I guess, of the strictures of the Islamic Republic. Hijab is a symbolic issue, but there is a broader kind of weight of the theocratic state that weighs upon women. I would guess to a degree that is heavier than men. But in general, the country has a whole host of economic and political problems. Some of them, of course, have been exacerbated by the maximum pressure campaign which the Trump administration adopted following its reneging on the Iran nuclear deal. But a whole, the factors bringing about this crisis in Iran aren't purely to do with the United States and have a lot to do with internal dynamics in Iran. For example, especially in Kurdistan and in Baluchistan, in addition to the problems that all Iranians suffer under the regime, there's also the national question and the economic and political exclusion of certain national minorities. It's not a general case. Some national minorities, such as the Azerbaijani Turkish population, are relatively well placed in Iranian society. But Kurds and Baluch, for a variety of historical reasons, have been excluded. And I would note Baluch are probably more excluded than Kurds. Kurds are Sunni, Iran is a Shia state. Baluchis are also Sunni, Iran is a Shia state. But also there's a kind of colorism directed against Baluchis because they tend to be darker, whereas Kurds, and you can't tell the difference between a Kurd and a Persian just looking at them. So there's a whole host of factors that seem to have come to the fore in this crisis. And, we spoke to Eskender Saredi Borjadi, who is a historian. We spoke to him on This is Revolution. I would recommend, if people have time, to check out that episode. He's probably one of the preeminent scholars of the Iranian left, and he makes the point that compared to earlier protest movements such as the Green Movement, this movement seems to have a larger social base than previous outbreaks of unrest. There have been outbreaks of unrest over the years in Iran. Sometimes restricted to the Kurdish provinces, or sometimes restricted to Baluchistan, sometimes restricted to the middle class of Tehran, sometimes restricted to the oil workers or certain elements in the economy. But here we're seeing a kind of general protest movement, and the Iranian regime, which now is completely consolidated in the hands of what we might call the hardline faction of the Islamic Republic. The reformist movement has almost entirely been destroyed. It was crushed between, increasingly aggressive American policy and Iranian deep state that, fundamentally didn't trust the reformists to run the state independently. So you have this really sort of retrenched Iranian state based around security services, based around the Aghazadeh, the people who have connections to the business conglomerates, the religious foundations, who in fact benefit from the particular sanctions regime that the United States has imposed on the country, and that their connections allow them to appropriate the wealth of the country. You have this core of the regime, and then you have a growing protest movement, but one which doesn't seem to have a strong organizational base. It's largely an organic protest movement. And of course, various political groupings outside of Iran, from the Shah, the crown prince, so-called crown prince, and the pro-Shah people, to the Mujahideen Khalq, a kind of weird cult-like political organization under the control of Mariam Rajavi, as well as other groups are trying to try to appropriate the narrative. But it doesn't seem that these groups are the ones even directing things on the ground. People do send them pictures and videos, but this seems, at least to my understanding, to be largely an organic outburst of anger against a whole host of problems facing the Islamic Republic.
And what problems are facing the Islamic Republic? I mean, there is a sense that these seemingly left protests tend to cycle around economic issues, and then are sparked by a cultural issue.
Sure.
But what are those specific issues? I mean, we do have we've had the Trump policy, which was even exacerbated under COVID. We have the fact that the U.S. has not really relaxed those policies at all, even after democratic regime change in the United States. So there has not been an attempt to say reestablish an Iran deal like what happened under Obama, nor do I think would it be trusted anymore, because even if the actor who made it would be seen as in good faith, it would be seen as a political football, probably rightfully, in the hands of geopolitics, of the US's geopolitical like goals. So what are the organic situations like hitting Iran that aren't because of, say, the blockade, are because
Sure. I mean, obviously, it's impossible to entirely disentangle those issues from one another. And I can probably speak to the situation in Kurdistan specifically better than I can speak to the general situation in Iran, although I have some, thoughts on that, but, they're perhaps not as well founded on my kind of historical area of specialization. So with regards to the Kurdish area in particular, since basically the collapse of the armed struggle at the end of the Iran-Iraq war and the going into exile of the main left nationalist forces that operated in Kurdistan, that's the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, which is a different party from the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iraq, although it has a common origin, just to make things complicated, and Komala, which was a more explicitly Marxist revolutionary political party, all of whom engage in armed struggle, both in the context of the struggle against the Shah and then against the Islamic Republic, against the kind of Islamist takeover of the Iranian Revolution. Kurdistan became one of the first battlefields for the Islamic Republic. It is a kind of truism that the road to tyranny in the Middle East usually goes straight through Kurdistan and the repression of the Kurdish minority. But in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a kind of relative liberalization, and we see the emergence of civil society organizations centered around issues, domestic violence, environmentalism was a big one. We have the gradual spread of the PKK or its ideological affiliates into Iranian Kurdistan with the foundation of PEJAK, which was an offshoot of the PKK, which engaged in some armed struggle, but really didn't challenge the Iranian state. And then, of course, you have cultural associations in Iran. All of this is tolerated. There isn't a complete suppression of Kurdish language and culture in Iran, but it's very heavily controlled and monitored. And, there's a very heavily securitized situation in Kurdistan. On top of that, Kurdistan is a relatively backwards part of the country, or at least a relatively underdeveloped sort of peripheral region of the country. As I said at the top, it's not the poorest region in the country. But, if you look at the statistics, or at least what, Kurdish groups, and the Iranian government, what you see from them is, there was a UN report in 2019, which noted that although Kurds make perhaps, between 8 and 15% of the population, these ethnic statistics are always difficult to pin down, but, 8 to 15, they make up about 50% of the political prisoners in the country. And they also disproportionately get the death penalty. Now, a lot of the times, this death penalty is being meted out for, drug offenses, for smuggling. There is a whole smuggling industry into Iraqi Kurdistan, which very poor people get involved in. But of course, this is a kind of reflection of the economic underdevelopment of the region and the fact that Kurds are, disproportionately rendered to the reserve army of labor in the Iranian economy. So, compared to, for example, Turkey, there is perhaps less of the kind of visceral social distrust between Kurds and Persians and other groups than in perhaps other countries. Although, Persians often have a kind of condescending attitude towards the Kurds. There's a kind of contradiction in the Iranian nation building process where, according to the mythos of Iranian nationalists, Kurds are Iranians and should be proud Iranians, but, manifestations of Kurdish political and cultural distinctiveness are often either heavily monitored or suppressed by the regime. So in Kurdistan, obviously the economic crises that have periodically hit the state have, led to protests. There are particular cases a few years ago, for example, a young girl jumped to her death, and the story that came out was that Revolutionary Guards were attempting to rape her in a hotel room, and she jumped to her death to escape. There was a case of a Kurdish language teacher who was, accused of separatism and put in jail for 10 years, which was later reduced to 5 years. A very draconian sentence. There is, I hear from a lot of Iranian Kurds, for example, in the province of Kermanshah, where the population is Kurdish but predominantly Shia. There is also a kind of campaign to stamp out the use of the Kurdish language. There are a whole other, there are periodic protests and strikes in the region. Kurdistan has always kind of been at the vanguard of opposition and resistance to the Islamic Republic in general. Resistance to the Islamic Republic from its inception in the form of the armed struggle, as well as being, a central place where the reform movement in the early 2000s gained support. And, there were members elected to the Iranian parliament, although, that process was kind of halted with the return of the hard reactionary wing of the Islamic Republic in, the mid-2000s and the kind of breakdown of the reform movement. So Kurdistan has always kind of been a tinderbox, and I should probably add, this is often portrayed by both Persian nationalists and Kurdish nationalists as being like, well, there's a separatism problem in this region. But I would probably suggest the reality is a little bit more complicated because, in general, Kurds in Iran, are not necessarily desiring to, become independent completely from Iran, but want some kind of national self-determination within the framework of Iran. This has been the line of the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran. This has been the line of Komala. This has been the line of Pezhek. So there are a few kind of weird organizations that are like pan-Kurdish nationalists, but they don't really have any social base. So there is a kind of strong national character to the protest movements in Iran, but what that means at any given moment may change depending on the actions of the Iranian state. And currently, we're seeing a major escalation in that violence, particularly in Sanandaj, which is, or Sinna as it's known in Kurdish, which is the capital of Iran's Kurdistan province. There's a province in Iran called Kurdistan, although Kurds dominate 3 provinces in Iran, Kurdistan, Western Azerbaijan, and Kermanshah province. So there's resistance across Kurdistan, and it's looking like the Iranian state is really trying to, is really engaging in a severe crackdown on the population. We're seeing videos coming out of shelling, gunfire, protesters taking control of various cities, people singing patriotic songs. Again, the meaning is ambiguous sometimes with some of these songs, but definitely, there was a video of people singing, as Kurdum, Welati Kurdistan, I'm a Kurd, my country is Kurdistan. Strong nationalist elan of these protests, but that does not necessarily mean it's separatist. If we move to the rest of the country, which again, is not, my field of expertise so much, although, I follow the news and I have to teach Iranian history as part of my job. I mean, the Islamic Republic has, in the 1990s, there was a kind of opening up of the Islamic Republic, the emergence of the reform movement. Then there was a kind of shift back with Ahmadinejad, if you remember, and then a toing and froing. But what we've seen with the election of Raisi and the rejection of the Iran nuclear deal, and more, realistically, since 2009 and the Green Movement, is the reform movement has kind of been gutted. Many of its leaders have been placed under house arrest, been under house arrest for like 10 years. Rouhani's big gamble to open up the country and to the West through the Iran nuclear deal came crashing down with the reversal of the Trump deal. And so there's a kind of despondency because you have this narrowing of the Iranian state, this retrenchment to, a core of a clerical elite, a nouveau riche bourgeoisie that has gotten rich of the Islamic Republic, and the Iranian military-industrial complex, which, as my friend Iskender pointed out, it's small, obviously, compared to the American military-industrial complex, but it is very significant within the Iranian political system. There are a whole bunch of military and paramilitary apparatuses in Iran. There are also a whole bunch of religious foundations that operate as businesses as well. So you have this kind of they call them Aghazadas, the son of the sons of the elite, many of whom are able to travel back and forth to Canada, enjoy their money overseas, while the rest of the population is impoverished. So I think this crisis has only become more acute with COVID, for example, with the general global economic crisis, and Iran has become a tinderbox. And we're seeing a kind of inchoate protest movement that is drawing together different social groups, and it's really hard to follow who exactly is involved in these protests. But whereas the Green Movement was largely restricted to a kind of elite in the Persian core, and the national minorities have protested in the past, and those risings have largely been isolated as well. This seems to be like some kind of bigger protest movement, although one which doesn't really have a program clearly, but is being driven by a lot of young people, who these like Zoomers in high school. You're seeing pictures of these young girls in the schools shouting down the various people and coming to talk to them, going on strike. So there is a lot of anger. It's part of its generational, part of its economics, part of it's against the corruption in the country. Iran's Gini coefficient has gotten worse over the years. Iran has subjected itself to some kind of neoliberalization in the past. Ahmadinejad got rid of the subsidies, for example, and was praised for it by economists. So, Iran has this economic kind of doomsday taking place, which obviously affects different parts of the... Well, I'll give you an example. One of my friends from Iran, I spoke to her on the phone. She was telling me about, a member of her family who had a reasonable job in a business, and then suddenly when 2008 comes, everybody was fired, right? So like suddenly people who had like a pretty good, university educated people, pretty good job, boom, out of a job or like losing their salary and things like that. So it's hitting many sectors of society, and that's hard to bear. And then of course on top of it, there's this like controlling apparatus of the Islamic Republic, which uses, like the modern mechanisms of state surveillance to impose what it deems to be appropriate Islamic attire, appropriate Islamic behavior. Again, I'll refer you to the interview with Iskender, where he points out they now have like cameras which can like take a picture of a woman in a car to ensure that she has the appropriate headscarf on. And people are people are tired of this. Another Iranian friend who had visited Iran in the summer, and for people who don't know, my partner Sarah is Iranian and was brought up in Iran. Came to visit us, was telling me things are really dire in that country. People are really depressed and despondent and fed up. whatever hope there was that the Iran nuclear deal would lead to the better future, it's evaporated. So this is like the murder of this young woman at the hands of the morality police, and the state's attempt to like cover it up, has just led to this spontaneous explosion of action. Now, I guess that brings us to the question of the color revolution.
It does.
And I mean, it seems just obvious to me that when a country that is counter-hegemonic, that is opposed to the United States, when it has an internal problem, of course, the United States might try and take advantage of it. All kinds of nefarious forces will attempt to seize control of the moment or extract advantage from the current situation.
To say, like, you would expect both the American intelligence operatives, Saudi intelligence operatives, Russian intelligence operatives, various other regional powers, they'd be on this like fries on shit, but it doesn't mean they created the conditions or set it up, right?
Exactly. They didn't create the conditions. The Islamic Republic made a whole load of political decisions which made the situation worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not the Americans that are imposing morality police on the population, right? It isn't the Americans that are encouraging, elements connected to the state to, appropriate the wealth of the country. Iranians, they see Iran projecting its military power across the Middle East, spending money on operations in Iraq, in Syria, and in Yemen and other places, and they're like, well, what the heck is going on? What are these wars? Why are these wars being fought? One of the interesting aspects is like there is a kind of, and I don't know how widespread this is, but there is in certain ways a hostility to the Palestinians in Iran, which is the reverse from the situation in 79. Prior to 79, the Shah had it was an open secret that the Shah had relations with Israel. And so the question of the Palestinians was, intimately linked to, the question of overthrowing the Shahist regime. But today, the fact that the Islamic Republic has appropriated the Palestinian issue has, flipped the situation. So now people like, screw Palestine, we don't care about that. What about us? So we have like a very different kind of state of affairs in the country. But this is to do, a lot of it's to do with the policies adopted by the Islamic Republic. The fact that the hard line that controls the levers of power in the country, the military security services, and the gerontocracy of the clergy, the fact that these people control the levers of power and the political decisions they've made have, brought the Iranian people to this situation. That the Americans are, partly responsible for the hardship in the country is a truism. But it is, one can be, it's like, it isn't that difficult, in my opinion, to hold two thoughts in your head. The first, that this is a genuine protest movement for, liberation in Iran, even if it's a kind of liberal, bourgeois, democratic liberation. It would be an improvement on the current situation in the country. Hold that, while at the same time not wanting the United States or other powers to militarily or economically or diplomatically escalate problems with Iran. In fact, one has to understand that very economic and diplomatic and military escalation from the Western powers and regional powers opposed to Iranian interests like Saudi Arabia, that very escalation is precisely what the hard core of the Islamic Republic requires, both to maintain its legitimacy and also to enrich itself. Seems like you're thinking.
Well, yeah. I mean, which drives me to ask you, if it is rational to believe that opportunistically any intelligence service with interest in the region would be trying to shift this to its advantage, the Russians probably are not that well representative now because they have their own problems. How much is larger geopolitical concerns driving our narratives about the region and not what's actually going on in the region itself? I mean,
when you say our, who are you talking about specifically?
well, I mean, our narratives about the region being either leftist narratives or American narratives. We can talk about either one.
Right. Well, I think in general, and I don't know, you'll probably agree with this. Americans in particular, and people in the Anglo-Saxon world more generally, tend to project their own cultural war paradigms upon societies where those cultural war paradigms don't make sense.
Right.
And of course, countries try to obviously exploit this. I mean, Russia deftly exploited this. For the right, Russia was this anti-woke power reasserting, heteronormativity and, traditional values, rejecting multiculturalism. All the while in Russia, the issue of multiculturalism is a lot more complicated, considering the kind of
it's a multi-ethnic state and always has been.
It's a multi-ethnic state, and it sees itself as a civilizational state with a whole bunch of. I mean, like when they conquered Chechnya, they didn't murder all the Chechens and replace them with ethnic Russians. They established a kind of Islamic vassal state from which they could recruit neo-Cossacks from, right? So there is Russian chauvinism, obviously, but Russia is a more complicated society. So this kind of white supremacy, neo-Nazi, or even conservative narrative doesn't quite fit. And then, of course, a whole bunch of people on the left got kind of suckered into a notion that Russia was a anti-imperialist state, that they projected on Russia the ideological counter-hegemonic position of the Soviet Union. And obviously the Russians kind of played with that through their media networks and through
Although not if you listen to anything actually said in Russian. But go ahead.
I mean, we see this with other, if you look at Al Jazeera, the most liberal,
newspaper out of the Middle East in English, but if you read it in Arabic,
yeah, it's a very different thing. So the Russians deftly manipulated this. The Iranians did too, with Press TV getting on all kinds of people, mobilizing anti-imperialism as a kind of ideological, framework within which groups on the left and the right, and Tehran and Moscow could cooperate within this framework of anti-imperialism, which really is actually just kind of a crude inversion of American exceptionalism, something that I've said numerous times on numerous platforms before, that a lot of this kind of quote unquote Marxist anti-imperialism just comes down to kind of pure inversion of American exceptionalism and a kind of rejection of liberalism in toto. So I guess we have elements on the left who project a kind of 20th century version of decolonization and the national struggle on what are essentially right-wing capitalist states like Iran and like Russia. And Iran and Russia, whether one argues that they are in the Leninist sense imperialist countries or not imperialist countries, they are capitalist powers. They are capitalist powers with aspirations to regional and even global importance. And I think a whole bunch of people, particularly on the left, although I would say there's a kind of counter weight to this, where people get sucked into a kind of positive American exceptionalist liberalism. Putting it another way, we have a faction who call themselves anti-imperialists, whose entire narratives are driven by America is bad and anyone who opposes America must be inherently good or must be defended on all cases, because they view things as a state-to-state issue, that there's an American state, and then states that oppose this American state's interest must inherently be good anti-imperialist states. So it's although many of them call themselves Marxist-Leninists, they substitute class analysis for a vulgarized and crude form of core periphery analysis, overlaced with a kind of crude Orientalism and a self-loathing for their own society and the proletarian classes in their own society. So that's one faction. The other faction obviously ends up rallying behind the American bourgeoisie and liberals on the grounds of anti-fascism. Putin is a fascist and the Islamic Republic is a fascist state, blah, 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 that kind of discourse as well. So, I'm not saying the opposite trend to this is any good, but, under the rubric of either anti-imperialism or anti-fascism, the left in the United States tends to degenerate into a kind of petty bourgeois nationalism, whether that's in the third worldist form or whether that's in the kind of like hammer and sickle NATO form.
Yeah, and this is not new. I mean, it's affected people I respect on the left, going all the way back to W.E.B. Du Bois, who parroted like the early Marxist-Leninist Third International line that like Imperial Japan was going to be progressive because it broke up European hegemony, and was an imperialism counter to Western imperialism, which some a very few, but some people in the ML world have maintained to this day, even though that's not official, that was largely abandoned even during Stalin's lifetime. But I find there's a new valence of it than before. Like, I remember when I was becoming a leftist in the 90s and aughts, we were actually, Iran, like Ukraine, is one of these countries that U.S. political tomfoolery has always made it part of the limelight, but there's been a kind of counter movement in the even before Marxism was repopularized in the American vernacular, to view it just take what it was saying at face value. I remember like people talking about Chavez meeting with Ahmadinejad and how that was a good thing, and I was like, and at the time I remember going, that's just driven by geopolitics and desperate geopolitics, actually, because these people aren't natural allies like at all. Yeah. And some people trying to make really wild excuses for that, but that was not a dominant part of the discourse. It really didn't come up much. The sort of, and even people like standing the reform movement, the Iranian reform movement, which was pretty much crushed in the early aughts. That also wasn't really presented that much. I mean, I never heard it talked about on a college campus at the time it was happening, except for a few minor reports in the back of NPR. So I bring that up because the American obsession with geopolitics is somewhat new. Maybe that is a result of still being a major hegemon, but not being the major hegemon anymore, and just tell everyone what to do. Maybe it's a result of the 9/11, the Iraq War. I don't know. Maybe it's a result of the fact we're in worse economic times and people are paying attention now. Maybe it's the fact of the internet. There's 1,000 factors. I'm not going to attribute any one cause to them, right? But it does seem to me now that it is almost harder to get good information on the subject, because people are often self-propagandizing, one way or the other. And they're often surprised or just out and out don't believe certain things that are, even when they see videos on YouTube that confirm that this is happening, they will say that it's decontextualized or this, that, and the other. How is, if you're a responsible leftist commentator, how do you handle this? And I mean, this is something you and I both think about, because we both, think a lot about geopolitics and tell American leftists they should care about it and have coherent stances on it, but also tell them that what they say on Twitter about this shit really doesn't matter, and there's some things you probably should just shut up about.
I mean, I think this, it's like an interesting question. I mean, I think the reaction, I mean, I don't know, I don't know concretely what the X factor is to make people care more, that's made people care more about geopolitics. And I think you're right. There's a whole bunch of factors in play. I think, the fact that the United States has been like openly involved in the Iraq and Afghan wars over the last 20 years, has played a role in it, has brought the, issue of American empire to the foreground. But I think, a lot of people, when they begin to sort of reject the liberal / conservative narrative of, America as the indispensable nation, as being like, we make mistakes, but, our hearts are in the right place and we have the power to reshape reality, whether that's the kind of neocon version, whether that's the kind of intersectional imperialism of liberals. I think once people begin to see through the facade of that, they just invert everything.
Right.
But the question comes is, if you're going to look at things, if you're going to try and analyze geopolitics, which is difficult because, we can all make mistakes, you have to treat all information from states as being motivated by an agenda. That includes the imperialists. But, we saw this concretely in the run-up to the Ukraine war. A whole host of figures in left media in the United States consistently came out and said, this is all imperialist lies. Russia has no intention to invade. And, I didn't think Russia would invade. People who followed, people who are not, Marxists, were skeptical about the invasion narrative.
No, me too. I mean, that was
it seemed like a crazy move, right?
I think until, and then when it was building up, and I was like, well, maybe the Biden administration really isn't just making shit up, but it's going to be a limited campaign like we saw in Georgia. It's going to just go into the Donbass
no, it was a full. So the point is, the imperialists tell the truth sometimes. And the question you have to ask yourself is, why are they telling you the truth? The problem, just because someone is like from an oppressed minority, it doesn't mean everything they say you have to take as gospel. If it's a kind of weird standpoint epistemology in which, like, if the American state says it, it must be a lie. And if someone who's opposed to America gives a narrative, that must be the truth. It may or may not be in particular cases that the state is lying to you, or like, people, opposing American interests are telling you the truth. But that can't be taken as a given if you want to understand geopolitics. You have to, so much of the left are wrapped up with like identifying with states, right? Mm-hmm. It's not our job to identify with states, and states will act. All these states are, I mean, like, let's not get into the Cuba, Vietnam, China discussion of, are they state capitalists, deformed workers, states, socialists on the way. Look, put those aside, right? The majority of these states, from Libya to Assad, to Iran, to Russia, these are right-wing capitalist states. Many of them are developmentalist states because, capitalism needs heavy state intervention. That's how capitalism gets done. Some of them has welfare programs. That's cool too, right? But let's not forget what these states are and what their character is and what they've done. People cheering on Saddam Hussein as being, well, he was overthrown because he was a socialist. In the late 80s, Saddam Hussein was trying to neoliberalize the economy of Iraq. They had a whole process called Infitah, which was this opening, and they had in Egypt, they had in Libya. All these countries were trying to liberalize their economies. And parties like the Ba'ath parties rose to power on the graves of the left. The Islamic Republic rose to power on the graves of the left. One of the reasons, one of the few places in the Middle East where, there is a kind of mass left-wing movement is in Kurdistan, is because, that was a kind of like last bastion of where it could retreat to. And the one part of Kurdistan where there is no left is Iraqi Kurdistan. Why? Because the Kurdish nationalists won there and took over, right? So, so many of the, so many of these people they're rallying behind are, are like right-wing capitalist regimes that happen to be opposed to American interests. As you pointed out, Japan, Nazi Germany, they were counter-hegemonic capitalist powers opposing the dominant imperial powers of the time. Heck, the Japanese, their critiques of European imperialism were pretty accurate and fair at times.
And I think people forget that Mussolini talked about proletarian nations even after he went far right. Like, it's their ability to use our rhetoric, and they recruited large numbers of leftists in most of these movements too, and then also liquidated them in most cases. One of the few cases where the leftists weren't totally liquidated is actually fascist Italy. So, they were killing communists, but if you converted, they didn't purge you like they did everywhere else. I mean, this is something that I just can't wrap my mind around, because there are reactionary counter-hegemonic powers, and there are natural sort of responses to that. And honestly, I'm not saying that all the responses in Iran or anywhere are going to even be left-wing. And Iran, I suspect they have a kind of reformist nature, but I lived through the end of the Arab Spring in Egypt, and the consolidation under al-Sisi, and people were doing weird contortions. I think I saw Norman Finkelstein attack Samir Amin, late Samir Amin, whose work I like Samir Amin's work actually quite a bit, but Samir Amin couldn't figure out who to even back. Well, that's in all that.
Well, that's a more general problem with the current phase of world history. I mean, not to make it too grandiose, it is a kind of world historic problem because there is no organized left, and what is the outcome of the fact that there's no organized left? Well, it's a very concrete thing. I mean, you break into the palace, you get on the president's peloton, you have a swim in his pool, you take a dump in his toilet, and then what's the program? Well, who wins in that progress? Invariably, as it was in this Egypt, the political right won. It was the Muslim Brotherhood who were at the vanguard of the revolution and who enjoyed its fruits until the military returned.
Right. And they had to do so on the back of the same actual state apparatus that the military was built on. They did not establish their own state, really.
And even in Tunisia, where there was, at least for a time, a real shift towards a kind of more liberal, democratic, capitalist democracy, even that's being reversed at this present time with the actions of the current presidency. So we have these popular waves of anger at like the at the system in these countries, but there is no program, no alternative program of government. There's no clear, idea of how to overcome the impasse that the society has arrived at. Like the Americans went in and destroyed Iraq, right? But it's entirely possible that Iraq would have eventually imploded like Syria did anyway. The Americans didn't make Syria implode. Syria made Syria, the whole bunch of other factors made Syria implode. That the Americans, by pouring weapons into Syria, prolonged a civil war, you can make an argument for that, right? But in the actual motivational force behind these upsurges at governments, whether they're pro-American governments or anti-American governments, the forces are generally kind of indigenous to those countries and societies. I mean, of course, historically, the United States has intervened in countries. There's CIA, there's school. A lot of the time they mess up, but they have had some successes. Usually when they've had successes, though, I would note that these have been in the form of military coups. And why in the form of military coups? Because the American military often had peer-to-peer relations with the high command of these various countries. In order to mobilize these militaries, needed a relatively small group of people to be involved. Like what was the Mossadegh coup in the 50s? The reactionaries in Iran and the United States and Britain, get involved. The military step on board. They pay some gangsters in Tehran to, fiddle around and cause trouble. And, they have a coup d'etat, right? But these kind of popular, unrest that's taking, they aren't just CIA operations, right? Even the Maidan and all these, and the Orange Revolution before that, even those were not necessarily motivated by the CIA, but because people were fed up of a corrupt regime. The fact that that corrupt regime was aligned with Russia meant that obviously the United States was predisposed to that particular movement and sought to influence the way that movement, concretized itself politically.
Right. I mean, and also would like to point out that like the actual scuttling of the joint deal with Ukraine joining just the EU, which Putin was relatively okay with, and staying as a part of this kind of trade alliance between Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, was also scuttled more or less by Germany, not even the US. So it's, which you could say that Germany was acting, as a U.S. client state. I think people who view European politics that way tend to miss that at that very time, Obama's administration was caught spying on Angela Merkel in the lead up to that situation, and tensions between the EU and particularly Germany and the U.S. were kind of high, actually. Not enough to threaten the strategic importance and special relationship of the EU to the United States, but nonetheless, it even looked like people in China were going to be able to use this in the long run to kind of spin Europe off of an axis with the United States, and that was explicitly stated policy in elements of the Politburo. I mean, that is all over. So,
I mean, a lot of these states, within the Western alliance, pursue their own independent foreign policies, obviously within the material confines of America, but often they are the primary shapers of policy on the ground. Look at Syria. It was Turkey for a long time, with the support of the United States, that was, engaging on a lot of the on the ground activity. In the United States only got more directly involved following the debacle with the fall of Mosul in 2014 to the Islamic State, that forced the United States to come in. But regional actors were pursuing their own foreign policy agendas. Now, of course, those foreign policies have limitations. Turkey, this is one of the things, I find quite interesting about Turkey is that, for Turkey has long pursued an independent foreign policy, has put its interests first. But, there have been clashes with American interests, such as, the invasion of Cyprus probably wasn't something the Americans super wanted. The Americans weren't happy with Bülent Ecevit in the late 70s and, were involved in the coup against him. There have been rocky roads at times between America and Turkey. But, obviously, there are limits to that. Turkey can never really break from the United States to a full extent. So a lot of its breaks with America are just rhetorical. That's why they changed the name of Turkey to Turkey, because it's a kind of like victory for anti-imperialism, which like literally costs nothing. They can just go to the public and say, look, we made everybody call the country Turkey. It's like, yeah, if you tell the UN to call your country, Dick Farmer country, they will call it that country. They'll, it's like,
yeah, I mean, like we call Czechia too with some reluctance, but we do.
Well, Turkey is even worse because, Czech Republic and Czechia, that's the difference between an ethnonym and a toponym, right? Whereas like Turkey is literally like, I was arguing with people on Twitter about this. This guy was I don't want to go into it, but like the grammatical and historical illiteracy behind the fact that like this professor was telling we picked Turkey because it's from Arabic. And the reason he says that is because, there's an Arabic adjectal form of Turk, which would be Turkiye, right? But the word Turkiye comes from the word Turkiya, spelled with an alif, an A in Ottoman Turkish right up to the early 20th century, which comes from the Italian Turcia, which is the, like a Latinized form. Anyway, but, like you have this kind of pseudo anti-imperialism, this pseudo cultural imperialism taking place in countries like Turkey. But they have limits, but at the same time, they can wag the tail can wag the dog. America does not have the expertise or the knowledge on the ground or the, deep integration that countries, regional powers like Saudi Arabia have and that Turkey have. Like, look at Saudi Arabia, they're still an American client state, but they're like sticking the middle finger up to Biden with the oil production quotas. So, so like capitalist countries pursue their own interests. They, might not want to fall too afoul of the dominant imperial hegemon, but, it's a two-way relationship, right?
Right. I mean, like, for example, for all of its threats, the U.S. has backed down on some of its own policies in regards to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia, while it might be messing with Biden at the pump, is not, for example, leading to de-dollarize oil production because, frankly, and I don't think people understand this, the U.S. is almost as big a player in the oil market as Saudi Arabia is now. It definitely is in our hemisphere. We use more of our own oil than we do with theirs. So it makes me wonder, like, all that would probably do is accelerate the disintegration of OPEC itself. Which, okay, fine. And a lot of these things, I hate to tell people, are going to come in the next 10 to 15 years anyway. We either move off oil or we start to move off the amount of oil that we're using, and I'm not as optimistic as a lot of people on current green technologies, or we don't, and we start running out of things.
Who knows? I mean, the question the question on geopolitics as well is, and you've mentioned this before, Varn, like the concept, BRICS is going to be this new counter hegemonic force, that there may be a kind of like a more consolidated anti-American or, more, let's say, forthright anti-American alliance at some point in the future. That's certainly a possibility. But this kind of grand united front really like breaks down when you begin to think about it, especially because, India and China, that would be the two locomotive forces behind such an alliance, have very, very different interests. And
they're almost at war, earlier in the last 4 years.
I mean, there's a whole host of, contradictions not just between the United States and the rest, but also between various different powers that will attempt to exploit the great powers and their interests for their own particular conflicts and rivalries. Or even, we spoke to Harun Yilmaz, for example, just before the Ukraine intervention, Ukraine war. Russia intervened into Kazakhstan, and like a lot of people was like, this is an American, they're putting down an American. Harun was like, no, this was just like a kind of factional fight. There was a protest. People, were pissed off about the oil prices. They're in a country swimming on natural gas. Everybody's natural gas prices are going through the roof. The, leading cadre of the state are like getting wealthy. People protests, and, Russians came in to support one faction in a factional fight in the country. Americans weren't like driving that force, but everyone yells color revolution, because they view the world in it's just like an inverted bourgeois morality, where it's like America bad and it's American exceptionalism, except that American exceptionalism is bad. Whereas
the most American people I met abroad when I was an expatriate were people who would not do anything that reminded them of America while they were in said country. Right. They would only date local women. They would only do this, that, or the other. And usually they were kind of imperialistic dicks, like in the way they actually interacted with people. But, it didn't really matter. And a lot of them, and I mean, I know this is anecdotal, but I literally have had this conversation 3 separate times while I was abroad, where someone said to me, well, I heard that America I came up believing, during, at my age and the cohort I'd be in, there were people who grew up under Reagan and Clinton, and to a lesser degree, Bush Sr. I believed that America was a shining city on the hill, greatest country, and I realized that it wasn't. And I'm like, and so your response to that is that we're uniquely depraved. We're not that special.
Right.
Like, we're just that powerful. And we're kind of an accidental hegemon and not particularly great at it. But we have a shit ton of resources. And I've told people recently, like, start thinking about geography, even about how you think about this stuff. But the other thing I think is when people hear buzzwords like multipolar, and they're getting it from communists who are getting it from fourth positionists in Russia, are from like Eurasianist in Turkey, or what, whatever, maybe BRICS proponents. If you actually look at the origins of that and the predictions of that theory, and I mean before Fareed Zakaria started throwing it around 15 years ago too, in classical English international relations geopolitics school, multipolar worlds mean that very similar states vie to set up their own trade networks, and that smaller states will usually try to appeal to the hegemonic power that is far away because they can exert less immediate dominance on them.
Right, exactly.
Like,
Kuba put it in a very, concrete way. It says, like, all multipolarism will do is just reorder which people are getting crushed and which people are not getting crushed. But the fact that people are still getting crushed will be the same. So, and we're focusing on the kind of anti-imperialist here.
But I think it's also true. I mean, I also think the American hegemony people are also kind of ridiculous. So, but let's talk about that for a minute, because we should give them the proper due. There's actually more of them than the people we're complaining about.
Yeah, so, I mean, on the left, I mean, like what's happened on the left, obviously, is like, we've got these anti-imperialists who are pretty annoying when it comes, especially if you're from a place like Kurdistan or Iran, because they like project their own bullshit on your countries, and you're like, no, it's a shitty country, and we don't want to live under this horrible regime. Mm-hmm. And they're like, somebody, I don't know if it was true, an Iranian person on Twitter they went to a DSA meeting and a speaker came there and said, no, we shouldn't support these protests. They're reactionary. The Islamic Republic is progressive because it supports Palestinians. I saw somebody on Twitter, some Communist Party of the United States person, blathering on about how Russia was a progressive power because of dialectics. This
Oh
kind of
no, I saw that too. It was Russia was not a progressive state, but it was playing a world historical progressive role because of these dialectics, and we have to understand the contradictions, comrade. And I'm like, as a person who actually takes dialectical systems theory very seriously, and that is classical dialectics as read through historical materialism and modified by modern notions of system mechanics. I don't know what the fuck they're talking about. I don't even know what they think a contradiction means, other than trust us.
It doesn't make sense at first, but that's because it's a contradiction. There you go.
Yeah, and I'm not even totally sure, my friends, that this is undone dollar hegemony. It is, quite frankly, complicated the Belt and Road Initiative to the point I don't think it's going to happen now.
And solidified NATO.
And it's solidified NATO as a bloc, and it has made the ability for China to warm up to NATO. I mean, not NATO, warm up to Europe, nearly impossible.
Yeah, I mean, so these people, jab at that. But, to be fair, there is another faction off the left, which...
And of society at large, really.
But, let's talk about the left specifically. I don't expect, I mean, no, that's unfair. I think there are good anti-war liberals out there who, frankly, are a lot better than many so-called self-identified leftists on these kind of issues.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who are...
There are solid anti-war liberals, so, that's not a problem. But I think there is a faction of the left that has convinced itself that it's lapping anti-fascism, right? That rallying behind... because they can only think in state forms, the Ukraine conflict becomes a conflict between Ukraine and Russia.
Right.
And so they rally, and frankly, on a moral level, it's way more understandable to rally. There's a way more visceral reason to rally behind Ukraine because they are the attacked party.
Right. They didn't start it, and also it seems like they've been kind of dominated geopolitically. They're a smaller power, etc.
But how does this get transformed? Well, it gets transformed into a Second World War lap. Just as the fight against Trumpism devolved into anti-fascism, so too does a geopolitical conflict between the United States and Russia, with Ukraine just being barbarized in the middle. That gets turned into a crusade against fascism, and anyone who opposes you is a Russian agent or a Russian sympathizer, or is sympathetic to, or is shilling.
Or a Putin sympathizer because they're really because they're a Trump sympathizer. And I say this, Djene, because this I actually encounter at work. Mm-hmm. It's not the most dominant opinion of my colleagues at work at all. Actually, most of my colleagues kind of just like, I hope this war ends soon. Like, that's pretty much what they think about it. Right. But I have a few colleagues who are dyed-in-the-wool Democrats who all of a sudden sound like Christopher Hitchens talking about Iraq, to borrow a comparison from Ben Burgess, when they're talking about Ukraine, and ignoring like the historical complications of that, because it's not an easy. And I say this as a person who has friends from Ukraine. I mean, one of my friends in the left media sphere is like born in Kharkiv. In Soviet Ukraine. And I have Russian friends too. I have Russian listeners who have appreciated the fact that I have not demonized either Ukrainians or Russians in this scenario. Because frankly, most of them didn't have shit to do with why this happened in the first place anyway. This is another delusion of the left that they think without taking power, popular support can somehow change geostrategic logic. And I'm just like, it has in my life never actually done that. The anti-war movement in America didn't change a damn thing about Vietnam. And I know that's an unpopular sentiment, but it's a true one. The Viet Cong is what changed the situation in Vietnam. So what's my point on that? I guess it is to say that I think when people are like, well, you should stand against NATO, and I'm like, sure, yes, you should. You probably should stand against NATO, but you should understand that in these situations, like in Iran, it's a very complicated situation, and I don't say that to absolve us of responsibility, but it's a complicated situation where taking the wrong side can create hostility to other parts of your politics.
Mm-hmm.
And by wrong, I mean misleading, talking shit about other countries, pretending that all Ukrainians are all Russians or fascists,
Right.
taking very facile notions of anti-fascism. And let's be specific. When we call what anti-fascism has ended up being in the hands of Democrats, okay? And I have anti-fascist friends who will probably get mad that we use it this way, but has ended up being like the most militant pose for the Popular Front. Right.
Exactly. Both in domestic politics and in foreign policy.
Correct.
It has been the ideological rubric under which the Democratic Party can weave an exciting political narrative to mobilize its, very tired base into political action and to maintain support for, prolonging the conflict, playing a hard line in the conflict in the Ukraine.
Right. I mean, yeah.
That's what it's become. That's what it's been turned into. Is it in essence that thing? No. In the same way anti-imperialism is transformed from opposing the imperial adventures of your country to shilling for bourgeois nationalists in reactionary right-wing regimes that are not in your country, right? That's the problem with these ideologies, because they've become unmoored from any type of organized left that can contend for political power. Thus, either the left retreats into a fantasy, projects its fantasies onto other countries, or it projects a kind of wishful thinking that the Democratic Party can be dragged screaming and kicking to the revolution.
Yeah,
And
delusions of tailism or paranoia seem to be like kind of the two options on hand when you embrace this, and don't see your task as kind of building a internationally, but I would say locally internationally, because you should probably, if you're working in the United States, be focusing on fucking Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean, and reducing tensions with Cuba, etc. I mean, yes, we're a hegemonic power, and there's things you should care about, like Palestine, but immediately, like the immediate left that you would need to organize with to do anything in your own country, where your skin is in the game, are in the bordering nations, because we share a really integrated supply chain and workforce, particularly after NAFTA, right? And that does not mean we should not care. It does not mean we should not be, anytime we can put public pressure on a peace position. But the thing is, I mean, let's be honest, because I've had people push back. Well, who's going to sue for peace for this? And this was, on a thing. And I was like, you know what? I have no idea, because now that this conflict has started, the only way I can see it ending is inertia or becoming a greater conflict.
Right. I mean, now at the end of the day, though, because we have no political power, it's kind of irrelevant what we think.
Exactly. We're not doing anything about it.
We can't do anything about it. The only call we can have is like, I hope this ends pretty soon. And that sounds pretty weak, but, we are pretty weak as a left. And, anything that moves towards de-escalation and the loss of human life would be a positive move. Yeah, like it's going to be sucky, whatever the kind of peace treaty happens. If Russia takes territory, that's going to suck. They're going to, those territories are going to be devastated. Whatever remains of Ukraine is devastated. But it would be probably a positive step, at least, that, at least rockets aren't being fired at people and children aren't being murdered and killed in the collateral damage. These are not nice things. Like I get like the impulse to say, well, the Ukrainians have the moral right to defend their homeland. It's like, yeah, but like at some point you want to have a negotiated way out, right?
Yeah, I
Like
was going to say, like, yeah, they have a moral right, but the other thing that you have to realize is like,
there's no point if you're dead.
Yeah, and it's already the case that like Ukrainian civil society is broken. There are elements within the Ukrainian government who have used this to get rid of political enemies, to which I don't say to demonize Ukraine. It's what happens in a fucking hot war that is also contested on your territory.
Violence is reactionary, and
Bingo.
inevitably will end up with reactionary outcomes, right? Uh, like from a Kurdish perspective, there's the kind of moral case like Kurds should fight until they drive the oppressors out of Kurdistan. It's like, yeah, that's like cool, but what would be like way better? Some kind of negotiated solution where like people can put down their arms. Maybe you don't get a big pan-Kurdish state, right? Maybe you get some kind of autonomy or like civil, but like at least just like I don't really care what it looks like so long as like the immediate conditions are ameliorated and people's like immediate like liberal democratic values are like rights and are kind of respected. Because resistance is a kind of contradiction. Resistance is required for like the oppression to be lifted, but at some point, at what point does that violence just end up becoming reactionary? I don't even know, but like it's better to reach a negotiated solution before you get to that point than it is to have an endless conflict which costs endless lives, destroys and polarizes people to a situation where they just can't live with each other anymore. Yeah. Where like it just doesn't become possible. The societies become so broken that like any people have done such horrific things to each other that like any hope of reconstituting a peaceful life is entirely eliminated. So my fear for the Iran situation is that these protests will be strong enough to destabilize the Iranian regime, but not strong enough to overthrow it, and will end up with Syria 2.0, except on a bigger scale, in a larger country, another kind of depressing and destabilizing, endless civil war. And I was talking to a friend about this. She was like, "Oh, but Iran," I was like, before the Syrian civil war, Syrians were like, "Oh, this can never happen in Syria. This is not Lebanon, right?" But it happened in Syria, right?
Yep.
Especially with the increasingly what's the word I'm looking for? Brittle nature of the Iranian state. Its inability to have like political safety valves to direct opposition, right? Mm-hmm. That is dangerous. There's a danger of that even in a country like Turkey, because under the AKP, the institutions that kept the country from civil war, albeit oppressive institutions, there was a kind of relatively developed kind of bourgeois state with the multiple, checks and balances. And now it's been appropriated by the supreme leader in the country, which makes it more brittle. So there's like so many things to worry about. So like this could all end in, a big disaster. But even if it is successful, I think, the best case scenario is that Iran becomes a kind of like Eastern European style democracy, like with money pouring in, where some people get rich, some people get poor, but like people broadly have some kind of liberal democratic values, right? That's the best case scenario.
Democratic Shia Prague doesn't sound horrible.
I mean, yeah, like it'll be a capitalist democracy, but you know what? Like, do you think the Islamic Republic isn't a capitalist dictatorship? I mean, like a capitalist democracy would probably be okay. And like the truth is, like if you're lapping and thinking that like there's an Iranian path to socialism, like as Iran by itself, it's like you're smoking the crack pipe.
Yeah,
Like
that just belies not just a no knowledge of geopolitics; it belies no knowledge of economics.
it's like, Marxism is about socialism in the core countries of capitalism being able to spread out. Now, what those core countries are today, probably I would say include China, which is like which has the greatest proletariat in the world.
Yep, and the most militant. I mean, even against the Chinese government, sometimes, usually against regional government. Honestly, not the national government, but still.
But but like, and you could envisage perhaps a successful socialist system in a hemisphere, provided like the hemisphere had not just the natural resources it required, but the technological and
industrial. There's definitely continental blocks, except for Europe. Europe actually can't see as a continental block. It doesn't have enough resources. But I mean, it's a weird continent too.
Europe, the Middle East, and Russia could make build a kind of functioning socialism. And sure, between the technological and resource things that you could have, North America could probably do it. Maybe North and South America, whatever, right? Like it doesn't have to be, but like to have a kind of relatively, like small nation state, like build socialism by itself seems kind of like, it's like, I don't know.
Cuba's
like,
the only example we got, and it's had to liberalize more than people realize. So,
and there's limits to what you can do in Cuba, right? It's like, socialism on a tropical island is nice.
Yeah,
it's better than Haiti.
And not a lot, not a huge population either. But I say that because I just think people don't think, like, even when people are like, well, we could have what they had in, like, Northern Europe, and I'm like, yeah, we can, but not the way they have it in Northern Europe. It's our country is different. I know when I say that, I sound like a conservative, but I'm just like, no, I mean, like, Marxists have to think about the resources and scale. And this also means, by the way, we need other ways to deal with, and you and I are going to eventually do a whole series on this, but other ways to deal with nationalities, national identities, and identities in general within these kind of polities, because otherwise you're going to have ethnic strife or majoritarian cultural hegemony that is at least culturally eliminationist. I don't mean that they're necessarily going to kill anybody, but and I don't particularly want that either. But I don't think that, actually, this is beyond the purview of us talking about what's going on in Iran and talking about being responsible geopolitics in general. But I do think we have to admit that, like, we can neither use the model of European ethno-nationalism based on linguistic or racial grounds, nor can we ignore that these identities are substantively real, and to plow them over will generate all kinds of legitimate backlash, right? Like, I think you're a big proponent of, cultural nationalism as like cultural autonomy within a system,
I mean, like there's there is a well, I'm in favor of kind of for example, within an education system, a concrete question. You don't have a separate school for Persians or a separate school for Turks and a separate school for Kurds in a town. You have a school where all those languages are taught side by side, right? Pedagogically, there's not, like, monolingualism is just a kind of malady of the modern era. It's not.
Yeah, it's really, you're going to get away with it in, like, China and the United States anyway.
And so, I think encouraging people to learn each other's languages, having but having people also physically interact with each other and engage with each other. We have to, like, both. It's a difficult one because you have to both stop reification in terms of the way that by creating cultural institutions, you reify, ethnic differences, where people might have like a kind of elastic relationship with language and culture and identity. They might feel, both Ukrainian and both Russian in some ways, and speak both languages or not speak. You need to find a way to both stop a reification just through a kind of institutional imposition, where it's like, do you go to the Turkish language school or do you go to the Kurdish language school? Because that's, defines who you are on your ID card, on one hand. And on the other hand is a kind of blind universalism, which really ends up just being being a kind of backdoor cultural chauvinism of the dominant ethno-national community.
Yeah, believe me, look at French laicism.
Right, exactly. So that's, exactly. So we have to find a way to both surpass the limitations of that. Perhaps some of that has to be done through a vibrant civil society coming into being. So perhaps some of that has to be related to, important institutions in society adopting multilingualism and as a kind of a default posture. Maybe it involves ensuring that government in some ways is centralized to the top, but in other ways is devolved down to the smallest level, so communities can make decisions for themselves within a particular set of, general democratic rights. And also perhaps it means there are different solutions to different minorities. Perhaps in a country like Iran, you could have, geographically defined, ethnic, quasi-ethnic administrative federalism. Perhaps that would work in a country like that, whereas it wouldn't work in other countries, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, there have been attempts at this. I think about Chile's botched constitutional reform that had plural nationalism, but didn't define what that was. Didn't even look to models of it. Like, I think technically speaking, China is a plural nationalist country, but we can also see there's tensions there, and
Right.
there's tensions between even the definition of nationalism of which the Chinese people and government may operate under at any given time. There's sort of an ambiguity in some spaces between Chinese nationalism and Han nationalism, and we saw the same thing in Russia with the vast, the oscillation between encouraging nations, but then peoples like the Siberian indigenous peoples not getting nations because whatever arbitrary reason, usually they weren't seen as having a legitimate state at any time in the past because they were basically hunter-gatherer tribes.
Yeah.
But and that's not being respected. I do think you have to deal with that. Like for example, indigenous issues in the United States are in a socialist North America will have to deal with relationships to land use and stuff like that, and what cultural nationalism means for various different indigenous peoples. Because I will tell you, when I talk to most indigenous peoples, they do not mean European nation states, but what they actually do mean is actually often quite not articulated. So, and people are trying to do that. But if the only model you have is the European nation state, well, then, I don't want to turn the whole world into North Africa and the Middle East and Europe in the early 20th century, East Asia until the 1950s. I mean, like, I can go on. So, on that point, and this, I guess we're ending up on the topic of why I'm now reading. You basically gave me a graduate seminar of additional readings in addition to the ones I've already read on nationalism so that we can do our show. If people wondering why it's taking a while, I have about 20 books to read in addition to the other 20 books I have to read for other things.
This is my plan for the Christmas holiday, actually, is to go through these books as well.
Yeah, I got to sit down and read. So because everyone's like, well, what do you think about Benedict Anderson? I'm like, I like Benedict Anderson enough, but there's
a lot more.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, that's kind of like, I don't know. That's that's the basic bay of talking about nationalism on the left. Like,
yeah, it really is. Like, people, like people don't even really reference Hobsbawm or Miroslav Koch, who are both like Marxists as well. They don't look at Otto Bauer. They don't read Stalin.
yeah, I mean, you do
Or
actually have to
Lenin.
read Stalin
And
and
Lenin.
Lenin, and maybe a good history of like why there is a subtle difference between Stalin and Lenin, and then why someone like why Luxemburg and Pannekoek opposed them, Stalin and Otto Bauer,
And Otto Bauer.
and yeah,
Well, and exactly like the whole Otto Bauer thing. My critique of, for example, cultural autonomy is the Leninist critique of cultural autonomy, because it leads to kind of like a reification of difference within communities, and it becomes a kind of bourgeois nationalism, right?
but like one within the context of a non-bourgeois nation, which leads to like for example, basically ethnic like if you know Austro-Marxism at all, this is actually something that's unique to it, but was a problem. Like different ethnic groups in the Austro-Marxist scenario under Otto Bauer were actually undercutting each other. While they were trying to argue for a unified front of socialists and communists against the fascists, while everyone else was like, when both the SPD and the Third International were absolutely refusing to even consider it. So, it's like an irony of Austro-Marxism. And on one hand, they're arguing for like pluralistic defense of socialist, like your grievances between the two of you are legitimate, but right now we have a mother enemy and we shouldn't have to side with capitalists to fight that enemy.
Right.
Pretty big point. And conversely, yet within our own system, we have all these various ethnic cohorts that are actually at odds with each other and undermining each other, making it very hard to fight fascists within the Austro-Hungarian.
It's a problem, man. It's a problem. So it's really a question we have to like take seriously, and try and understand that like cultural difference, national difference means different things in different contexts as well. It's not like a one size fit all question as well. So
I mean, it's people seem to get that about race, but they don't get it about ethnicity or nationality,
which is the same thing. It's the same,
right?
Like,
it's like basically race is just the broadening of national and ethnic social constructs beyond language to something arbitrary but seemingly biological, like skin tone.
But within the context of particular nation states, it plays exactly the same function as ethno-national difference. Like functionally,
yes.
It's the same. And when we talk about black people in the United States context, we're usually talking about the black people in America and not the black people all over the world.
Right. Well, and I've actually seen this lead to weird scenarios. I talked about this once on air. I was sitting at a charter school listening to a Black Lives Matter activist in 2019 talk to a group of international students, and then there were a bunch of black students there. They were all African, not African American. And so the speaker was like, well, we have to combat whiteness. So it's okay for people who would identify as white to identify as Irish or English or whatever. And I'm like, is it though? But whatever. I get what they were doing. Right.
Right.
And then they're like, but we black people need to come together and defend Africa. So into defending Africa, this speaker got a lot of, praise. When they talked about a unified black identity, my Mali, Nigerian, Somali, and Ethiopian and Eritrean students looked at her like she was insane. Right? Like, it's just like, it was like, what are you talking about? Like, we're not the same religion. We don't look that much alike. Like,
from like different sides of the continent.
Yeah. it's a very big continent. You were just talking about how it's misportrayed in the United States, but then you're kind of doing it. Like
exactly. It's problematic. It's always problematic, my dear friend, Varn.
right.
Like these things are bloody minefields for the left, but it's because we have to theorize them properly, both understand what it means and why, and also have some kind of political solution to it. You know, quite and yeah, that's what I would say on that. But yes, we do need to get cracking talking about nationalism, because I think that's something that needs to be addressed on the left.
Yeah, that will be our project. I mean, it will be kind of a I don't know if it's formally a joint project between TIR and This Is Revolution. I mean,
Sure, why not? You know,
TIR and This Is Revolution, just TIR and Varblog. People do need to like, at least right now we are separate entities, but yeah,
we're friends.
we are friends.
We're internet friends.
And I will have met most of you. Sadly, not you yet, Gene.
No, not me.
But by the end of October,
Yeah, it's going to be an exciting time.
Yeah. So it will be fun. I think I got my passport back, so I can go down to Mexico and
living the dream. How many sister wives are you taking down there?
None.
No sister wives?
No sister.
Oh, you're
wives.
gonna look for a new sister wife. I see.
Yeah, I'm gonna recruit another one in where would I be doing that? LA or Rosarito, maybe?
Rosarito,
I don't know.
or maybe both. Is there always room for another sister wife? I'm sure.
Well, it's not like Islam where there is a four rule hard
less their concubines that you take.
Oh yeah, that's true. You have the concubines. Does anyone still have concubines as a side?
ISIS? That's like literally how they justified their slave markets.
Got it. Okay, so ISIS, because I had yet to meet in my entire travels in the Middle East a man with more than 2 wives. I'm sure there are, but I never met one.
It's pretty. It's like I had a cousin who had 2 wives. It was a real pain in the ass. They used to gang up on him all the time. Like his friend was killed during the war, so he married his wife, to make sure that her and her children would be okay. And those 2 wives just ended up fucking bullying him for the rest of his life. They had to go between 2 houses getting bullied. It's not as cool as people think. You can't have 3 ways with your 2 wives. You have to go and service them separately in their separate homes.
Yeah, it's not polyamory, folks.
It's not polyamory. It's not secularized sister wives, as I like to call it.
So, well, I am going to not continue this conversation, but yes, we are friends, and
we're not going from Varn Vlog to Varn Log.
So, Gene, where can they find your work these days? You're seemingly publishing. I actually had not realized how many articles you published in Jacobin on Turkish politics till like today. Yeah, Turkish and Kurdish.
Over the years, I try to make sure I at least have 1 article in Jacobin per year. Just to keep
unlike me, who has never been published in Jacobin, but there's probably reasons for that.
Have you ever sent an article for them to publish?
No.
Well, that's the main reason that you've never been published in Jacobin.
I've also.
Nope. That's the main reason.
That is the main reason. And
don't make up political persecution.
No, yourself. I'm not being politically persecuted. I was being a dick.
But you have to get them to reject your article before you can complain that you're too hot for Jacobin.
Here's the thing. I don't know who is too hot for Jacobin. I think actually you could probably, I mean, unless you sexually assault somebody or piss on Bashkar or Seth Ackerman's like shoes, they'll probably actually.
I think
still
Bashka would be
publish her.
totally cool with it as long as you didn't piss on him. Like, I think if you like Bashka seems pretty chill. Like he's one of the more confident big boys on the left. People hate on him. It's because he's like it's just because he's like more organized than most leftists, right?
Well, I mean, that's not hard though.
I mean, that's not hard, but in the city of the blind, the one-eyed man is king.
Yes, this is true.
And so Bashka is the king of the left because he has basic, business.
Because the left is basically also basically
he-
a media project.
So he has basic business skills and reads books.
Yeah,
which
I mean,
is like, and
you will notice he's the only well-off media person on the left who is not actually somehow tied to Air America Radio. Like,
or has a rich mummy.
Yes, or has a rich mommy.
A mummy.
We will leave Mark Twain alone.
Plantation Riddler. There's nothing wrong with Plantation Riddler. I have an idea for a comic book where he takes on Black Hammers. Plantation Riddler is like a left-wing superhero.
Yeah, Plantation Riddler versus
Benedict Cryptofash.
Benedict Cryptofash and or the Black Hammers.
And or the Black Hammer. Yeah, exactly. Like you could have a whole load of a whole series, a comic series of left media stars and then like wars with bad people.
That would, actually, if people are going to be in idiotic fandoms, they might as well start converting their politics into comics. So
yeah, I totally think they should. I would totally get
it could be about as interesting as a lot of what Marvel puts out these days.
That's true. Marvel's really not doing a great job. But, it is what it is.
It is what it is. All right. And on that note, now that we have degenerated to talking about popular culture, we know that it is time to end. Gene, I am too tired to go on tonight, but would you mind coming on for a Patreon show in a few weeks, just to talk a little bit of leftist strategy and smack behind the paywall?
We could talk. I have no strategy, but I have plenty of smack. So
right
behind the paywall.
Behind the paywall. I'm not so much into the parrot room thing, but
you do like a good champagne room.
Yeah, I do like a good champagne room. I realized in the champagne room something that I had not realized before,
which is
that Cuba has a sense of humor in public when it is behind a paywall. I knew it had a sense of humor in private, but that's a different deal.
Yeah, and behind you got to pay if you want the Cuba jokes. You have to pay for it
because he and I had a long discussion about Barazov. The Ukrainian Borat. So that was interesting.
That certainly does sound interesting.
Let that be an advertisement for the champagne room over on KIR. All right. On that note, we're going to end on one of the trailers that you made.
Nice.
Have a good night.